Have you ever been home alone at night and every little creak and groan of the house suddenly sounds like a footstep? It's a feeling we've all had, that primal fear that kicks in when the sun goes down and you're the only one there. Your senses heighten, your imagination runs wild, and the familiar comfort of your own home transforms into a labyrinth of shadows and strange noises. It's that moment when you pause the TV, hold your breath, and listen, trying to convince yourself it's just the wind, or the pipes settling, or anything other than what your gut is screaming at you. You are not alone. This feeling, this deep-seated anxiety, is something most of us can dismiss. We rationalize the sounds, we turn the lights on, and eventually, the fear subsides. But for some people, that fear is not just a product of their imagination. For some, the bump in the night is real. The shadow in the corner of their eye is not a trick of the light. They are the unfortunate few who discover that the scariest monsters aren't in far-off haunted houses or dark forests. Sometimes they're standing right on the other side of your door, waiting to be let in. So, turn down the lights, check your locks one more time, and get comfortable. Today we're going to be exploring 3 chillingly true stories about people who were home alone when they discovered the horror was already inside with them. These are stories that will make you think twice the next time you hear an unexpected noise in the dead of night. These stories are a stark reminder that sometimes the safest place you know can become the most terrifying. Our first story takes us to a quiet suburban neighborhood, the kind of place where everyone knows each other and nothing much ever happens. It's here we meet 17-year-old Alex. Alex's parents had gone out of town for the weekend to celebrate their anniversary, leaving him in charge of the house. He was looking forward to it, a whole weekend of video games, junk food, and no one telling him what to do. The first day went by exactly as planned, a blissful blur of pizza and virtual battles. As Saturday night rolled in, Alex was deeply engrossed in a new game, his headphones on, the world outside completely tuned out. The house was silent except for the digital explosions and the clicking of his controller. It was just past midnight when he decided to take a break. He pulled off his headphones, the sudden silence of the house almost deafening in comparison to the game's chaos. He stretched, stood up, and headed to the kitchen for a drink. It was as he was filling a glass with water that he heard it. A soft, gentle knock, tap, tap, tap. It came from the front door. Alex froze, glass in hand. Who would be knocking at this hour? His parents weren't due back until Sunday evening. He glanced at the clock on the microwave, 12:14 a.m. No friend would be stopping by this late without calling first. He stood perfectly still, listening. Maybe he'd imagined it. The house was old, it made noises. He tried to dismiss it, telling himself it was just a branch brushing against the door in the light breeze. He took a sip of water, his heart starting to calm down. But then it came again, a little louder this time, more insistent. Knock, knock, knock. There was no mistaking it now. Someone was definitely at his front door. A wave of unease washed over Alex. He crept out of the kitchen and peered down the darkened hallway towards the front of the house. The only light came from the faint glow of the television in the living room. He didn't have a peephole, a design flaw he was now cursing. His mind raced through the possibilities. A neighbor in trouble, a prank, or something else? Something worse? He decided the best course of action was to stay quiet. If it was a prank, they'd get bored and leave. If it was something more serious, he didn't want to alert them to the fact that he was a teenager, home alone. He backed away from the hallway and retreated to the living room, crouching down behind the sofa, his heart pounding against his ribs like a drum. He waited in the suffocating silence, straining his ears for any sound. For a few minutes there was nothing. Absolute silence. Alex started to relax again. He slowly peeked over the top of the sofa, his eyes fixed on the front door at the end of the hall. He was just about to convince himself it was over when the knocking returned, but this time it was different. It wasn't a knocking anymore. It was a heavy, rhythmic pounding. Boom! 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 It sounded like someone was using their entire fist, maybe even their shoulder, to slam against the door. The force of the impacts vibrated through the floorboards. The door rattled in its frame. This was not a prank. This was someone trying to get in. Panic, cold and sharp, seized Alex. He fumbled for his phone, his hands shaking so badly he could barely unlock it. He needed to call the police. As he swiped the screen, the pounding suddenly stopped. The abrupt silence was somehow even more terrifying. He held his breath, phone clutched in his hand, his thumb hovering over the emergency call button. What were they doing? Had they given up? Were they walking away? He crept back towards the hallway, needing to know what was happening. He peered around the corner, his eyes locked on the door, and then, he heard a new sound. A scraping noise. A metallic scratch coming from the lock. They were trying to pick the lock. Alex's blood ran cold. He was no longer just a kid home alone. He was prey, trapped in his own house with a predator just inches away. He knew he had seconds. He scrambled backwards, his mind a whirlwind of terror. He didn't even think, he just reacted. He ran to the back of the house, towards the sliding glass door in the dining room. As he fumbled with the lock on the sliding door, he heard a loud click from the front of the house, followed by the unmistakable creak of the front door swinging open. They were inside. He didn't dare look back. He finally got the sliding door open and burst out into the backyard, not stopping to close it behind him. He sprinted across the cold, damp grass, vaulted the back fence, and didn't stop running. He ran through his neighbors' yards, through darkened streets, his lungs burning, not looking back until he saw the familiar lights of a 24-hour convenience store a few blocks away. He stumbled inside, gasping for breath, and begged the clerk to call 911. When the police arrived at his house, they found the front door wide open. The house was empty, nothing was stolen, but on the living room floor, they found a set of muddy footprints leading from the front door, through the hall, and stopping right where Alex had been hiding behind the sofa. Our second story brings us to a recent college graduate named Chloe, who had just moved into her first apartment. It was the basement unit of an old, converted Victorian house. It wasn't glamorous, but it was all she could afford, and she was excited to have a place of her own. The apartment was a bit damp and didn't get much natural light, but it had character. The only slightly unnerving feature was a heavy, bolted door at the back of her living area that led to the building's shared, unfinished cellar. For the first few weeks, everything was fine. Chloe got used to the quirks of the old building, the groaning pipes, the creaky floorboards from the tenants upstairs. She was settling in, making the space her own. It was during her third week on a Tuesday night that she first heard it. She was washing dishes after dinner, the only sound being the running water and the clinking of plates. It was then that she heard a faint sound, almost too quiet to register. It was a whisper. It was so soft she couldn't make out any words, but it was distinctly a human voice. It seemed to be coming from the direction of the cellar door. She turned off the faucet, her hands still soapy, and listened intently. Silence. She stood there for a full minute, but there was nothing. She shook her head, figuring it must have been the pipes or maybe the TV from the apartment upstairs carrying through the vents. A couple of nights later, it happened again. This time she was reading on her couch, which was positioned against the wall opposite the cellar door. The whisper was clearer this time, though still unintelligible. It was a low, raspy murmur. It sounded like a man's voice. Chloe felt a shiver run down her spine. She muted the TV and stared at the cellar door. The deadbolt was securely fastened, just as she always left it. She tried to rationalize it. The building was old. Sound traveled in weird ways. Maybe one of her neighbors was a night owl who talked to himself. She even went so far as to text the guy who lived directly above her, asking if he was up. He replied almost immediately that he was at his girlfriend's place across town. A knot of anxiety tightened in her stomach. Where was the voice coming from? The whispers became a semi-regular occurrence over the next week, always late at night, always when she was alone. They never got louder, and she could never make out the words, but their presence was a constant source of dread. She started sleeping with her lights on, and she found herself constantly glancing at the cellar door, a new, irrational fear of it growing inside her. She complained to her landlord, who dismissed it as the building settling. One Friday night, Chloe decided she'd had enough of being scared in her own home. She invited her friend Liam over to watch movies, hoping that having someone else there would either prove she was going crazy or validate her fears. They were halfway through a comedy when Chloe's blood ran cold. She heard it. The whisper. She quickly paused the movie and looked at Liam. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Liam looked at her, confused. "Hear what? I didn't hear anything." Her heart sank. Maybe she was imagining it. But then, it came again, a little bit louder than before. This time, Liam's expression changed. His eyes widened. "Whoa, okay," he said, sitting up straight. "I heard that. It sounds like someone's talking." They both fell silent, their eyes glued to the cellar door. The whisper continued, a low, constant drone. It was still impossible to make out the words, but it was undeniably there. Liam, braver than Chloe felt, stood up and walked slowly toward the door. "Hello?" he called out. "Is someone down there?" The whispering stopped instantly. The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. Liam pressed his ear against the cold wood of the door. After a moment he shook his head. "Nothing," he said. backing away. They tried to go back to the movie, but the mood was ruined. Every small sound made them jump. Liam left around 1 a.m., making Chloe promise to call him if she heard anything else. After he was gone, the apartment felt colder, emptier. Chloe triple-checked the deadbolt on the cellar door and tried to get some sleep, but she lay awake for hours listening. Just as she was finally drifting off, she was jolted awake by a new sound. It wasn't a whisper. It was a single loud thud that came from directly behind the cellar door. It sounded as if someone had stumbled and fallen against it. Chloe shot up in bed, her heart hammering. Then came the whisper, but it was different now. It was right up against the door, and for the first time she could make out a single raspy word, repeated over and over. "Let me in." That was it. Chloe didn't wait for another word. She grabbed her keys and her phone and fled her apartment, not even bothering to put on shoes. She ran up the stairs and pounded on her upstairs neighbor's door, who thankfully had just gotten home. She called the police from his apartment. When they arrived, they unbolted the cellar door and descended into the dusty, web-filled darkness with flashlights. They found a small, makeshift living space set up in a forgotten corner. A dirty mattress, some canned food, and a bucket. The person was gone, having apparently escaped through a broken ground-level window at the back of the cellar, but they had clearly been living there, just feet below Chloe, for weeks. Our final story tonight comes from a man named Mark, a writer who, seeking solitude to finish his novel, rented a remote cabin in the mountains for a month. The cabin was isolated, miles from the nearest town with the closest neighbor over a mile down a winding dirt road. It was perfect for him. No distractions, just him, his laptop, and the serene quiet of the wilderness. The cabin itself was cozy, with large windows that offered a stunning view of the dense forest. Mark settled into a comfortable routine. He would write all day, breaking only for meals, and in the evening, he would sit on the porch and watch the sunset. For the first 2 weeks, it was honestly idyllic. The solitude was exactly what he needed, and the words were flowing. He felt completely at peace, completely safe in his remote sanctuary. That sense of safety was shattered on a Tuesday night in his 3rd week. He had been writing late, fueled by a sudden burst of inspiration. It was well after midnight when he finally decided to call it a night. He saved his work, stretched, and walked into the small kitchen to get some water. The kitchen had a large window over the sink that looked out into the pitch-black forest. As he stood there filling a glass, a flicker of movement in the periphery of his vision caught his eye. He looked up, peering through his own reflection in the dark glass. He saw nothing but the inky blackness of the woods. He dismissed it as a deer or some other nocturnal animal. This was their territory after all. He finished his water and was about to turn away when he saw it again. This time, it wasn't a flicker. It was a shape. A tall, slender shape standing just at the edge of the tree line, partially obscured by a large pine tree. Mark's heart skipped a beat. He squinted, trying to make out what it was. It was too tall and still to be an animal. It looked like a person. A person standing in the middle of the woods, in the dead of night, just staring at his cabin. A cold dread began to creep up his spine. He quickly ducked down below the window, his mind racing. Who could possibly be out there? He stayed crouched for what felt like an eternity, his ears straining for any sound. A snap of a twig, a footstep, but there was nothing. Just the low hum of the refrigerator. Slowly, cautiously, he raised his head and peeked over the windowsill. The figure was gone. He scanned the tree line, his eyes darting back and forth, but there was no sign of anyone. He felt a small wave of relief, but it was short-lived. He wondered if his tired, overworked mind had played a trick on him. He decided to go to bed, chalking it up to exhaustion. He made sure the doors and windows were locked, a ritual he hadn't felt the need to be so thorough with until now. He lay in bed, but sleep wouldn't come. Every gust of wind sounded like a footstep, every creak of the cabin like a door handle turning. He kept picturing the shadow at the edge of the woods. The next night, he tried to work, but he couldn't focus. He found himself glancing at the windows every few seconds. He decided to close all the curtains, shutting out the dark forest, but it almost felt worse. Now he couldn't see if someone was out there. Around 10 p.m., he forced himself to open the kitchen curtain, needing to know. His heart sank. The figure was back. This time, it was closer. It was standing in the clearing between the porch and the tree line, no longer trying to hide. It was just a dark silhouette against the night, completely motionless. Mark could feel the blood drain from his face. This was real. This was happening. He backed away from the window, grabbing his phone. There was no cell service this deep in the mountains. The cabin had a landline, but the storm from the previous week had knocked it out and he hadn't bothered to get it fixed. He was truly cut off. Panic set in. He was trapped. He ran through the cabin, checking the locks on the doors and windows again and again. He grabbed the heaviest thing he could find, a cast iron skillet, and stood in the center of the living room, his back to the fireplace, trying to watch all the windows at once. The silence was agonizing. He had no idea what this person wanted, but their silent, watchful presence was a form of psychological torture. Hours crawled by. Mark didn't move from his spot, his knuckles white as he gripped the skillet. He didn't see the figure again, but he could feel it. He felt like he was being watched from every direction. As the first faint light of dawn began to break through the darkness, he finally felt a sliver of hope. Surely this person wouldn't stick around in the daylight. When the sun was fully up, he cautiously approached the windows and looked out. The clearing was empty. The forest looked peaceful again. Exhausted but relieved, Mark decided he was done. He wasn't spending another night in that cabin. He quickly packed a bag with his essentials, leaving everything else behind. He just wanted to get to his car and leave. He threw his bag in the back seat, got in, and locked the doors. As he started the engine, he glanced at the cabin one last time in his rearview mirror, and that's when he saw it. In the upstairs bedroom window, the curtain was pulled slightly aside, and in the gap, he saw the shadowy figure looking down at him. It had been inside the house the whole time. The thought that the one place you're supposed to feel completely safe can be violated is a terrifying one. For Alex, Chloe, and Mark, their homes transformed from sanctuaries into stages for their worst nightmares. These stories remind us that the locks on our doors and the walls around us are sometimes just a fragile illusion of security. The real horror isn't just the mysterious knock, the disembodied whisper, or the shadow in the window. It's the moment you realize your safety has been breached and you are utterly, terrifyingly vulnerable. These accounts serve as a chilling reminder to always trust your instincts. That feeling of being watched, that sound you can't quite place, it might be more than just your imagination playing tricks on you. It's a primal warning system that we should never ignore. The people in these stories survived because they eventually took action, fleeing a situation that could have ended in a far more tragic way. Their experiences are etched into their memories, a permanent scar left by the uninvited guests who shattered their peace.
Have you ever been home alone and heard a noise that made your skin crawl? That moment when your safe haven suddenly feels exposed. We all try to rationalize it. Just the house settling, or maybe the wind. But what if it isn't? Today, I'll share 5 true stories of people who discovered they weren't alone after all. These aren't campfire tales. They're real accounts of homes turned into scenes of terror. So turn down the lights, lock your doors, and listen closely. These are the moments when safety and danger blur, and the horror is already inside. Chloe was house-sitting for her parents, a responsibility she usually enjoyed. She loved the peace and quiet of their suburban home, a welcome change from her noisy apartment in the city. It was a chance to unwind, catch up on reading, and simply enjoy the solitude. Each night had been uneventful, filled with the comforting sounds of crickets and the distant hum of traffic. Until the 5th night arrived, bringing with it an unsettling change to the tranquility she had come to expect. Just after midnight, as the clock struck 12, a time often associated with mystery and the unknown, a steady, deliberate knock echoed through the house, cutting through the silence like a knife. It wasn't a friendly knock, but rather a firm, insistent sound that sent shivers down her spine. Her heart pounding in her chest, she cautiously approached the door and peered through the peephole, her breath catching in her throat as she tried to make out who was on the other side. But all she saw was a tall, shadowy figure, its features obscured by the darkness, making it impossible to identify the person standing there. The distorted view through the peephole only added to the unsettling nature of the encounter. The knocking grew louder, more insistent, transforming into a series of aggressive bangs that reverberated through the entire house, amplifying Chloe's fear. Chloe, now completely terrified, scrambled behind the sofa, phone clutched tightly in her hand. paralyzed by fear and unsure of what to do. She felt utterly vulnerable and alone. After 10 agonizing minutes that felt like an eternity, the knocking abruptly stopped, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. Silence returned, heavy and suffocating, filling every corner of the house. But Chloe, still trembling with fear, didn't dare move for an hour, afraid that the knocker might still be lurking outside. By morning, with the sun streaming through the windows, she tried to brush it off as a bad dream, a figment of her imagination fueled by the late hour. That is, until she mustered the courage to inspect the front door and saw deep gouges below the doorknob, fresh and raw against the wood. Someone had clearly tried to pry the door open, using a tool to force their way inside. The knocking hadn't been a random act. It was a calculated move, using the knocking as a distraction while they attempted to break in. The police, after examining the damage, confirmed her worst fear. This was an attempted break-in. They explained that the only thing that stopped the intruder from gaining entry was a sturdy deadbolt, a simple yet effective security measure. Chloe realized the real danger wasn't lurking somewhere far away outside in the darkness. It was already at her door, testing its defenses, waiting for a chance, a moment of weakness, to get in. Sometimes the scariest knocks are the ones you never answer, the ones that represent a threat you can't see but can definitely feel. For Chloe, home, once a sanctuary, would never feel the same again, forever tainted by the memory of that terrifying night. The midnight knocker was gone, disappearing back into the shadows from whence they came. But the fear lingered, a constant reminder of the vulnerability she had felt that night. She never stayed in that house alone again. She never stayed in that house alone again, forever haunted by the midnight knocker and the chilling realization of how close she had come to danger. David, seeking an escape from the relentless noise of the city, moved into a secluded rental in rural Oregon. He envisioned a life of quiet contemplation, surrounded by nature's tranquility. He was craving solitude, a sanctuary where he could finally hear his own thoughts without the constant barrage of urban clamor. The promise of undisturbed peace was the main draw. At first, the silence was peaceful, a welcome change from the cacophony he'd left behind. He reveled in the stillness, the absence of car horns and chattering crowds. It was exactly what he had hoped for. But as days turned into weeks, an unsettling feeling began to creep in. It started subtly, until he started hearing faint whispers, always seeming to emanate from the vents. Initially, he dismissed them as the wind whistling through cracks or the settling of old pipes, rational explanations for the inexplicable. He tried to focus on his work, determined not to let his imagination run wild. But the whispers grew more frequent, more distinct, morphing from indistinct murmurs into something almost intelligible. They seemed to be just on the edge of understanding, a tantalizing and terrifying mystery. One night, lying in bed, he heard a raspy voice, clear as day, seemingly right above his bed. It sent a shiver down his spine, a cold wave of dread washing over him. That was the breaking point. The line between reality and paranoia blurred. When that was the breaking point. The line between reality and paranoia blurred. He had to find out what was causing these unsettling sounds. Desperate and increasingly frightened at what was causing these unsettling sounds. Desperate and increasingly frightened, he called his landlord, his voice trembling as he recounted the strange occurrences. The landlord, initially skeptical, agreed to check the attic.
That's it. Agreed. You're deceiving the deals that did it in barrier. That are in. Saudi midi lagodi kaligwadong gusto lam dito na na. The only space above David's above David's above David's above David's at the bottom of the rank of the river, desolate tank,
The landlord's flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing a makeshift bed tucked away in a corner, a clear sign that someone had been using the space. Scattered around were food wrappers, remnants of meals consumed in secret. Scattered around a rim rooster in the sleeping apples, its purpose chillingly obvious.
It is not so much in the river, so. Accusator County took the medical detected for weeks.
The whispers weren't a figment of his imagination, not the wind, not the pipes. They were the voice of a hidden intruder, a silent observer, listening and watching through the vents, invading David's privacy in the most unsettling way. The police were called, but they found the attic empty. The intruder vanished without a trace. However, the evidence clearly showed the person had been there a long time, meticulously creating a hidden life within the walls of David's sanctuary. David, shaken to his core, moved out the next day, unable to shake the feeling of being watched. He was haunted by the thought of someone living just feet above him, a constant presence he never knew existed. Sometimes, the silence you crave hides something far more sinister than noise, a darkness lurking just beneath the surface of tranquility. The whispers were real, and so was the danger. A chilling reminder that you never truly know who or what might be lurking just out of sight. David never ignored strange sounds again, forever vigilant, forever listening for the whispers in the walls. Maya stayed alone in her apartment during spring break, a time when most of her classmates had left for vacations or to visit family. The campus was eerily quiet, the hallways empty, and the usual hustle and bustle replaced by a strange stillness. She was enjoying the quiet, relishing the chance to catch up on her studies and enjoy some much-needed solitude. The absence of noise was a welcome change from the usual chaotic energy of college life. But the tranquility was shattered when the power went out one night. The sudden darkness was jarring, plunging her apartment into an unsettling blackness. She lit candles, their flickering flames casting dancing shadows on the walls, providing a small measure of comfort against the encroaching darkness. With a sense of unease creeping in, she peered outside, trying to discern the cause of the sudden blackout. In the darkness, the courtyard below was shrouded in an inky blackness, the familiar shapes of trees and benches distorted and menacing. A figure stood motionless in the courtyard, a dark silhouette against the faint ambient light, its presence sending a shiver down her spine. It was staring directly at her window, an unnerving gaze that seemed to pierce through the darkness and straight into her soul. The figure held something shiny, glinting faintly in the dim light, an object she couldn't quite make out. It was wire cutters, their metallic sheen unmistakable even in the darkness. A chilling realization washed over Maya. The blackout wasn't an accident. It was a deliberate act. Her apartment was conveniently located next to the main circuit breaker for the entire building, a fact that now filled her with dread. The intruder had cut the power, severing the connection to the outside world and plunging the building into darkness. He was cloaking the building in darkness for a reason, a sinister purpose that sent a wave of terror through her. Terrified and with trembling hands, Maya dialed 911, her voice barely a whisper as she pleaded for help. She then hid in her bathroom, the only room with a lock, clutching her phone and praying for the police to arrive quickly. By the time police arrived, sirens wailing and lights flashing, the sense of dread had only intensified. The figure was gone, vanished into the night as if it had never been there, leaving behind only a lingering sense of fear. But the power lines had been expertly severed. A clear sign that this was no random act of vandalism, but a carefully planned assault. The police confirmed someone had deliberately targeted her building, though the motive remained a mystery. Maya never felt safe in that apartment again, the sense of security shattered beyond repair. Sometimes, darkness is more than just the absence of light. It's a warning, a sign that something sinister is lurking just out of sight. And the real threat is already watching, patiently waiting for the opportune moment to strike. For Maya, the silence of spring break, once a source of peace, became a chilling prelude to a terrifying nightmare. She moved out soon after, unable to shake the feeling of being watched, of being a target. She was always wary of the dark, forever haunted by the image of that figure standing in the courtyard. The power outage was no accident. It was a violation. An intrusion into her life that left an indelible scar. It was a calculated act. A chilling reminder that sometimes the greatest threats are the ones we never see coming.
Mark lived alone with his loyal dog, Buddy. One day, Buddy grew agitated, fixated on the basement door. Mark assumed it was a mouse, but Buddy refused to go near the stairs. Hours later, Buddy vanished. Mark searched everywhere until he noticed the basement door was ajar. He descended into the cold, cluttered basement, flashlight in hand. Behind the furnace, he found missing clothes, strange food wrappers, and evidence someone had been living there. A faint whimper led him to an old wardrobe. Inside, Buddy was trapped, shaking with fear. Mark grabbed his dog and fled. Police found a broken window. Someone had been sneaking in and out, hiding in the basement. Buddy hadn't been barking at a critter, but at an intruder. Mark realized the danger had been lurking just below his feet. The house never felt safe again. Sometimes your pet senses what you can't see. For Mark, Buddy's warning saved them both. The real threat was already inside. Sarah and Tom bought a fixer-upper with a locked upstairs room, supposedly sealed for years. One day, Sarah found the door wide open. No key, no explanation. Inside was a crude bedroom, dirty mattress, food cans, and hundreds of tally marks scratched into the wall. The room wasn't storage. Someone had been living there, coming and going through a crawl space. The lock could be opened from the inside. Police believed a transient had secretly lived there, leaving only when discovered. Sarah and Tom had walked past that door every day, unaware someone was just feet away. The illusion of safety shattered. Sometimes the scariest secrets are hidden in plain sight. The couple never felt alone in their home again. The locked room was a chilling reminder you never know who or what might be living just out of sight. Their dream home became a nightmare. These stories remind us how fragile our sense of security can be. A knock, a whisper, a blackout. Each was a warning that something was terribly wrong. The real horror isn't supernatural. It's the reality of someone invading your sanctuary. After these stories, every creak and shadow feels different. So tonight, when you hear an unfamiliar sound, you might listen a little more closely. Because sometimes the most terrifying threats are already inside, waiting in the silence. Thanks for watching.